Thanks for joining me today. I have another interview with people who have been helping me reflect on 15 years of blogging. Today, I have with me JD Smith. JD is a former employee of Gospel for Asia. JD was there from 2005 to 2011, and he was the initiator of a group that left Gospel for Asia, former staff members with Gospel for Asia, who raised some concerns about Gospel for Asia starting in about 2013 and really getting rolling in 2014. And that's what JD's going to really go into and kind of explain some of that process. So thanks, JD, for being with me and for talking about that process, some of which hadn't been talked about very much publicly.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right. First, let's go back before the process of raising concerns about Gospel for Asia and describe what first attracted you to that mission group, Gospel for Asia, and what did you do there?
Yeah, so we had known about Gospel for Asia for years as younger folks because they were involved with our churches. We were part of Calvary Chapel Network at that time. And they would come and, KP would come and speak at our church, Calvary Chapel Philadelphia. And, there were a lot of Calvaries involved with that. And then another number of other denominations as well were involved with supporting them. And they were a unique kind of ministry at that time because they seemed like they were doing the type of work in these most unreached areas with these, they would have stories of just amazing stories, missionaries that would give their lives to go and, set up churches in these places that had never heard the gospel. So it sounded like good work, really good work, and not the type of work a lot of ministries were doing, and so that was especially their claim. So, we would get involved with praying for different countries through them. And, they were, I guess, so what attracted to us was just, they were highly recommended by folks involved in our church, as well as a lot of different variety of folks. So just a lot of Christian leaders they would get endorsements from. They were, or became the second largest, I think, by revenue in the world as far as a Christian missionary organization. With over 100 million a year coming in. So they were not small, pretty well known. And their book was kind of, this revolution in world missions idea was appealing to folks where it was, hey, there's a great need out there in the developing world. We're here in the wealthy West, and we have the ability to support these, pastors out there that want to start churches but don't have the means to do it. And not to mention the poor and the homeless and so on. And so by coming and joining this organization on staff, you can help them advertise and get more support for these folks. And that was the draw to the home team staff office in Texas was helping them grow that mission. But the thing that seemed attractive at first was just this, the recommendation of it. Everything seemed very, KP sounded very humble in a lot of respects. Or just, very, it seemed very tight knit with the staff. And that was the thing that really, so we went over, I took a tour of India before we joined as a donor, and they had a whole kind of tour set up of their different, Bible schools and administration buildings and all the stuff that they do, printing presses. And they would show us all this stuff as donors that they were doing now and planning to do in the future. So KP was this kind of visionary guy. And so that, going to the field would give some legitimacy to what all was going on. And for sure, we met real people doing real work over there. So, there were those people that we met in those areas, whether that was, a percentage of the whole that they reported was going on, that's yet unknown. But nonetheless, there were some good things. And I personally know a couple of people who came to faith through radio programs that they aired over there and things. So they obviously were doing something good. And so we had something valid to grab onto. And then the thing I think that really attracted us the most, though, was when we visited their home office and met the staff. So the other staff were just an amazing community of people, and just loved the Lord. They were very dedicated, and they were very tight knit. Now the tight knit was kind of by design. There were mandatory activities and mandatory prayer meetings, and it was mandatory among their staff that they don't pursue other outside pursuits and things besides working for the ministry, and making that their major goal in their life is to promote the ministry. So, but nonetheless, they were genuine people. So the genuineness and love that we experienced with the staff there was real. I mean, they were the real deal, and they still are. A lot of them are friends with us to this day.
So you were donors before you joined. Did I hear that right?
Correct. Yeah, I had started supporting missionaries when they first came to our church, and so we, and then I got involved with other programs that they did and whatnot, and eventually they invited me over to India. And while I was in India, that's where I met KP, and he asked me if I would consider joining staff there.
Okay. Now, what was your duties? What did you do at GFA?
Yeah, primarily, I worked on their web team, so developing their digital marketing and website technology.
Okay. All right. Now, that was 2005, and you joined up at that point and spent 6 years there. What was it that led you to reconsider or think maybe this wasn't what I thought it was?
Yeah. So, I came kind of young, so, I was maybe not as theologically, mature as I am now. But we were interested in that, and we were involved with the local church here as well. I do feel like I had a lot of liberties given to me that other staff didn't have, because I would hear things from other people of ways they were treated or things like that, and I was like, I don't see that, I don't experience that, so I don't know, that maybe that's just them. And but I would hear complaints of various kinds of just people being spoken to abusively, or having to write something that they didn't really agree with or wasn't really true, or having to twist photos around, or just different things. I would hear concerns from folks of either integrity or more often the type of leadership interactions that they would have with leadership. So it was haphazard. So you would have a lot of interactions that were very, KP was very nice to you, and all this, and say lots of kind things, or help you out with this or that. And then other times where, people would just get reamed out and things. And so there was this haphazard nature, but my interactions were generally positive. Looking back, I feel that I was probably a valuable asset to them, as this, I came with a consulting background in the web technology space, and they needed that stuff to grow. So, they probably gave me exceptions that they didn't give other people. One of which was like leading a Bible study at home, for example. So other folks had been prohibited from having a home Bible study on the staff. I didn't really know that too much. Well, I did know to some degree. And so those were some red flags, right? Like, okay, if we're just church members that were part of a parachurch ministry that's, reaching the lost, I mean, what's the problem with, why would we frown on people studying the Bible? So you would, some of these red flags came up. They would say, well, we're banning women's Bible study. And I'm like, why? I said, well, because women talk. Well, what is that? Why is that bad? I mean, of course you're going to talk, but so red flags would come up. Okay, I'm going to look into this. And we'd talk to people, and, there was very, it just didn't seem very spiritually healthy from the leadership side. So the staff were trying to, follow the Lord. And, what's funny is just looking at that now. I mean, if my pastor said that now, I mean, I'd leave pretty quick, or if it wasn't resolved. At the time, though, we all were so just, amazed in our minds by the effectiveness of this work that was being reported to us going on. This idea, like every day, it was reported, okay, 14 churches were planted today because of us in the office continuing this work and being able to be the backbone of financial support for these thousands of missionaries on the field. And so there was a lot of room for grace in your mind for, let's say, a leader, and there were kind of sub leaders below KP, mostly David and John and a couple other guys who would kind of cover for him too and say, well, yeah, he's just had a bad week, or, he's very busy and, he's under a lot of stress and you got to give him grace. And people were thinking, well, even if the leadership is off, and there was accusations from former staff who had left that came up and started to raise red flags with us as well. But again, in our minds, we were just thinking, well, even if things are that bad, still we can forgive that for the sake of the fact that ultimately the gospel is going out. And that's what our mission here is at the end of the day. So, whether the leader is that good or bad in different areas, we could forgive a lot of that. So we gave a lot of things a pass, and maybe that we shouldn't have, but we were kept in the dark about what happened with situations. So when someone would raise a concern, it was their word against somebody else's word. And, and if you get involved with it and talk, then you start getting labeled. And some people that, did so were mysteriously fired, or, and then some folks would start getting fired, and the reason they would give for why they left or were fired, they would often say that the person chose to leave when really they were asked to leave. Mm-hmm. And it was very secretive about why or what happened. So whenever somebody had concerns, they were pretty much shuffled out the door before they could air those concerns to the other staff. Mm-hmm. So these things started to come up, and then staff meetings would come up where they were talking about planning this new campus or compound that they had built in East Texas. This was before they built all that. And people would ask questions because they were basically asking the staff to sell all their houses here in Dallas area and move out to East Texas and rent houses or lease them from them and live in, paid housing. But there's a lot of questions that come up with that. What do I do with my retirement plan? How do I factor in my home equity and whatever else? Do I have enough space for my kids and my dog and all this kind of stuff? And at meetings, in the staff meetings for that stuff, oftentimes people would ask valid questions and be shut down. So it was very much like, we're very excited, it's beautiful, it's going to be a wonderful thing, but then you've got to do it our way. And if people started to question that, they would get labeled as being selfish, or, and it wasn't a lot of time it wasn't direct, but it was more innuendo. So they would do things at prayer meetings like, they would oftentimes talk in a sermon message in a prayer meeting to the whole staff about an issue that one staff person had. Mm-hmm. And it was their way of indirectly making that person realize, yeah, I know they're talking about me. And everybody else would then start to think, oh, I don't want to do whatever whoever did. And it was a way of kind of keeping people quiet about things. So that kind of stuff would go on. They would say, oh, there's a group of people, we have a list, you can come to us if you want to know, but we don't want you to just seek counsel from anyone here. Everybody here is great, but some people just aren't spiritually mature enough to guide you in the right direction, and they might lead you astray. So if you want to talk to anyone about any matter of significance spiritually, come to us and we'll give you the list of people that we think are qualified to do that. So it created this invisible or sort of unknown, it was an unpublished list that no one ever really got. It probably changed on the daily, but it was, whoever would help us toe the party line kind of a thing. So enough little things came up that I started to, and I was unaware about, manipulative groups. I didn't expect that. I didn't experience that in my churches growing up. I only later realized a lot of folks have. And I started to do some research online, started asking more questions about it, and finally came to the point where I had conversations with my boss there, who's a good friend of mine who has since left. But, I was like, I just can't continue unless they're going to resolve these questions. I mean, I just don't understand why they wouldn't want to engage in dialogue on these certain questions. So it finally came to a head when I brought up things to KP directly, and he basically said, well, you can leave, but you can't ask questions, in a nutshell. And I was like, well, not much I can do about that.
And that was about 2011 when you left then.
Yeah. Right.
Was the Wills Point, we're talking about the Wills Point headquarters, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. So were you there at the beginning of the discussion for that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. When they were doing the planning for it is when we had left.
You left before they made that move.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of years before. They made that move finally in 2014.
Okay. All right. All right. So the time of your departure was 2011, and what about then this group that formed? There was a group of former staff that formed called the Diaspora. Tell me about that group and your concerns, probably because of more people joining it, enlarged, right? There was a I don't know how many, I think 5 major concerns. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So what were they, and how did the diaspora express those?
Yeah. So basically, we had kind of distilled all of our collective experiences after I left. A lot of us, each of us, I think, after we left, thought, well, this is just my experience. Maybe everybody else is fine, but I can't deal with this stuff, so I'm leaving. But then as people who left began to talk to one another, which was highly discouraged among the staff to talk to ex-staff. And so it took a long time for that to happen. And I really honestly think the advent of social media enabled it. If it wasn't for social media, I don't think most of the folks would have connected. But you tend to stay connected with people you're connected with on LinkedIn and Facebook and whatnot, and people know people. So it was relatively easy with social media to get back in touch with folks who left 15 years ago and say, hey, what was your experience like? Did you see these problems, or was it just me? We were all trying to figure it out and make sense of our experience. And so we got in touch with folks, and the emails people would send me. And yeah, back then, actually, it was a lot of pre-social media by email, but people would send emails with these testimonies that were heartbreaking about their experience there, ways they were treated or things that they were told and whatnot. A lot of people who wanted to get married to someone and were told that they shouldn't or couldn't, and things. So there was really a lot of way over the line controlling behavior from the leadership to keep people in the position they wanted them for the ministry. So we put all that together and kind of boiled it down to, we wanted to not address any issues that were not sin, because we thought, people are free to run their business or their organization how they want. If we don't like it, we can leave, right? But if they're acting as a church, which they kind of were, they would conveniently be a church when they wanted the authority of the church, but then not be a church when they didn't want the accountability. So we never quite knew, is this really a church? It was kind of this half thing. Now I think they're full on church with the Believers Eastern and all that. But at the time we were supporting the Believers Church on the Field, which was supposedly an evangelical church, we were told in the West, just like a Calvary Chapel, non-denominational, or a Baptist church or something, because those were the big supporters. And people were pretty put off when they found out about this Eastern direction they took. So anyway, we boiled it down to these 5 views. They had this idea of spiritual authority that was false. The idea that if you come to Gospel for Asia to work there, then the leaders of that organization are by de facto your spiritual authority. And the definition of it wasn't quite ever clear, maybe conveniently so, but essentially to disagree or go against what they're directing you to do, unless they're making you sin, essentially, is to go against God himself, is how it's positioned. The Lord will use these people just like he did Moses to the Israelites, and we would read books on this stuff, and so this idea of spiritual authority was taken way too far, to where people wouldn't feel free to question the leaders the way the Apostle Paul says we ought to, and make sure that hold them to the word, and call out sin among the elders, those kinds of things. That wasn't possible in that scenario. So that was one area where a lot of unhealthy stuff just became able to be covered up and practiced. And And then the prioritization of ministry over family was a second concern. That was one where it's clearly, the Bible puts your husband and wife relationship, your duty to take care of your wife and family is above your job, basically. But they really put your job in place of almost your devotion to God, and made it one and the same almost, to where it's above your family. So people would be encouraged to work overtime hours, even at the expense of, or travel weekends all the time, speaking at churches, for example. Some of the leaders did that, and they would grow up and hardly see their kids because they're away so much. And that was considered the right thing to do. And I'm not saying it's necessarily, you can put a line on it. But it really came to a head when there were some divorces involved, where people would end up having, concerns, saying, I can't do this, but the husband would kind of be counseled from other folks internally to the ministry because of this mindset to basically, put the ministry's needs above his wife's needs. And that happened a number of times, where people from either leadership or other folks, in line with this teaching, we're saying, well, you know what? You've got 14 churches a day being planted, all these lost souls in eternity. Even if your wife leaves you, this is a better thing. And it's,
wow.
Yeah, so that was anti-biblical. And we did see some divorces happen for just that reason, not more than one divorce. So that was a big red flag for us as well. Then there was this idea of being able to twist facts or manipulate things to protect the ministry. Essentially, the ends justifies the means was the mindset. And so we can doctor a photo where KP is wearing some Eastern, Orthodox looking garb for a Western PR thing, because the Western donors wouldn't understand that, we just wear these things for the sake of approval from the Indian government. And that was the story that was always told to us as well, was, they're going in this Eastern, more Episcopal direction for just that reason only. It's just to make the Indian government happy and give us more legitimacy over there, or something like that. When later we found it was that was the direction they were pushing it the whole time. But so we called that out. There was a number of instances in staff testimonies, where people had been lied to or been asked to lie for the ministry, and the excuse was, well, it's just going to serve us better at the end, or bring in more money from donors. And then number 4 was they practice unbiblical shunning. So I call it unbiblical because I do believe the Bible prescribes a biblical form of shunning in rare cases where you've got a church discipline case, you've got a person who's just flagrantly, unrepentantly promoting something divisive and sinful or something in the church. And still calling themselves a Christian and calling the thing good, let's say. Something like that, that's not a person a Christian would want to be associated with. I would say that's probably that's the only biblical type of shunning I can see in the Bible. But this unbiblical idea is, well, you really need to disassociate from the people the leaders tell you should disassociate from. And it's not necessarily mandated directly, but you're strongly rebuked a lot of times if you are associating with, say, ex-staff who don't favor the ministry anymore, or things like that. Or even just your own family outside of the ministry, which is something a lot of controlling groups do.
Right.
Where they're looking to, have more of your mind share and time share than the folks outside and your existing support base. The further you're separated from your support base, the easier it is to control you. So
they're not only controlling the Bible study, something of the doctrine, but also your social control.
Right, exactly. So you're kind of told what you ought to read. You're told who you should hang out with and who you shouldn't, who you should talk to and who you shouldn't. And, you're spending so much time that you don't have much time to pursue other things. You're financially kept at a very low level to where you don't have financial freedom to move. And oftentimes people would be put in career positions that were not beneficial for their career, like not their strength. I was not one of those people because they needed my skill set, but a lot of folks who, like some friends of mine who asked questions, my one friend was a gifted writer. he asked too many questions. They put him in the print room, so he's in shipping and delivery, where he can't really talk to other people in the office much, and keep him out of the way, but still get some work out of him. And so that would happen a lot too. But the shunning part was really if someone, left the ministry and wasn't totally all about them still, people would be internally kind of told that, yeah, you need to avoid that person. They're essentially going to poison you, is what you were told. They're going to tell you things, or even your worldly relatives who don't understand this special high calling that we have here. It's such a unique and complex thing, and nobody understands it but us. So they wouldn't understand. So when you go and talk to them, you're going to be influenced by them and their way of thinking, and be tempted to become worldly again or something like that. So people would be sort of manipulated into questioning, outside folks.
Mm.
So then that led to direct shunning later after this whole diaspora thing came, where we experienced it directly. And then the last one was prohibiting the Bible studies and really involvement in your local church and small groups. That was very limited. Now we did go to a church outside, but folks were very encouraged to stay internal. And a lot of folks who were our friends were prohibited from either hosting a Bible study or attending one in some cases. And so they had to do it without telling anybody or things like that.
Now, I recall as a part of the pointing out the difference between the Believers Eastern Church, their rituals and so forth, that you wanted to make it clear that they were saying one thing and doing another, that there was a ring kissing, a denial of the people in the Believers Eastern Church kissing KP Johannen's ring.
Yeah.
And you had video and photos, and they denied that. So that kind of loyalty was required, that even if you could see it with your eyes that this was going on. I mean, I've got a number of photos. I published them on the blog. You were still supposed to say, no, that's not happening. And so, first of all, maybe talk a little bit about the ring kissing thing that you guys brought to light. You all did. And then this idea that even though we can see it with our eyes, we're not supposed to say it's happening.
Yeah, well, and that was exactly what a lot got sent to the print room for, because it's like, you're a good writer, but you're asking questions about the sources like a good journalist should do. That's not going to work here. You just got to accept that the material is accurate and just publish it for us, please. So that kind of stuff would get folks in trouble. But yeah, the ring kissing, I never personally witnessed it because I wasn't over to India again after 2006, I think was the last time I was over. But yeah, people would go to leadership conferences and they would see it. So I know a number of staff who've seen it personally, and one who even spoke to KP in a side conversation about it. Like, hey, don't you think, what do you should? And KP was like, well, yeah, I'll tone this down or something, kind of a thing. But he would kind of excuse it like, well, we're trying to, be this Episcopal type church, and I'm the leader, metropolitan pope type guy, and so this is only just symbolic, and people, I don't really want this. People here just they want to do it, so it's of their own hearts that they're coming up and kissing my ring, kind of a thing, or bowing, and however you want to call it, bowing to my hand, indicating some level of bow and respect, right? Whether it's kissing or not, was what was going on. And then we heard from people who worked at the school there that they did have to do that, so there was a lot of reports of it. And of course we saw the footage where it was pretty obvious what people were doing. I mean, it's the same thing as you would see at any other type of denomination that does that, right?
Well, it was part of
they did deny it for a while.
An ordination service. I mean, they would come up and bow to him, and either put their forehead on his hand or kiss his ring. It kind of looked like this, they were doing that, and
Yeah.
say a few words, and then they were ordained.
Well, that's an example of the lying to protect the ministry that you saw the leaders doing. They had basically pledged to do that in a sense. If you read the ordination transcript, and there's actually an audio recording of one of the ordinations that was done. I think it was for Pat Emmerich, but yeah, I mean, he essentially pledges his life to KP and Gospel for Asia, which is, I'm like, you're a follower of God. Like, how can you pledge your life to a man? So now that they're in that position, that's held over them too. They've got to kind of toe the line.
So after the diaspora is talking about what's going on, and you guys are initiated and convened, and you've talked about all these concerns, you approached the Gospel for Asia board. Is that right?
Yeah, we felt that would be the right thing to do, and we sought counsel from our pastors because we also we knew that it would be a difficult task to approach them about these things, because we had already heard that many people had tried personally to have conversations about it. I had tried a number of times when I was there. In fact, a year after I left, I had an email exchange with KP even about some of my open issues that I still had, and then he wanted to meet up, and then he never got back to me. So there were a lot of people that had similar interactions, and most of the folks I reached out to in the beginning, and then other folks in our group reached out to, were aligned with our concerns. There was very few who weren't. And so they all felt in agreement about these concerns. And I drafted this letter that summarized them, and sent that out to the board under the counsel of our pastors. And they basically said, yeah, you should work through, this is an organization, you should work through the board. The board should be aware of it. And it seemed that the board had never known about most of these things. This was the first a lot of these guys were hearing about it. And it also seemed that it was largely a puppet board, where they were in the dark about a lot of things, which was some level of liability on them. But in any case, we didn't hear directly from board members at the time, but we got their addresses, and we asked for, in the letter, we kind of knew, based on the fact that they just would not respond to things, we were like, well, we better put essentially a demand for a response to make sure that it's very clear that we want this to be responded to. So that's why we did that. And of course, they took great offense that we demanded a response. But in reality, we were just trying to move things forward and make sure it happens, and just saying, hey, look, you can either respond to us, or we can go to sort of this next step. And the next step in our minds was to inform staff of our concerns. Mm-hmm. But we didn't even want to do that before we talked to the board and leadership. So we could have just sent this letter to all their staff and say, hey, we all have these concerns, we want y'all to know. But in June 2014, we decided we'd send a letter to the board first. And we also included all leaders that were like department heads and above within the organization, at all the international offices. So they had offices in at least 5 countries, and not the field offices in India and South Asia, but we did send it to like Western European offices in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, because we wanted, knowing just how the organization worked, we wanted that accountability to be there for everyone to get the letter at the same time. We express mailed them, and that way there was less chance that some spin story could come up with. So everybody would get at least a chance to read our first letter. So we sent that out. They responded back in a few weeks, according to our request. And then they basically said, this is all false. This is ridiculous, in a nutshell. And so then we decided, all right, we're going to try again and send the board, more signers. The first letter had like 35 signers or something. The second letter had like 75. 75 former staff aren't all making up a lie like that. You're not going to just get that. That's a lot of witnesses saying the same thing. So we sent that the second time, and I think that the board this time realized, okay, these folks aren't quitting on us, and they're serious, and these things might actually be serious. We need to look into it. At least some of the board members felt that way. So they told us, we're going to do this investigation internally and see if these things are true and get back to you. And so they appointed Gail Irwin, board member, head of that investigation at the time. And so a few months would go by, and it seemed like we're waiting and waiting. And I would call to check in on things. Finally, I think about 6 months after we sent the first letter, they sent a response to us, which was extremely terse, that just basically dismissed the whole issue and said, yeah, we find nothing wrong. We find these claims to be false, and we're going to have no further communication with you, is essentially what the response was. So we said, wow, okay, well, I guess better move to phase 2, which is, set up something like a website so that the staff themselves can see this stuff and judge for themselves. But going back to the reason I wanted to get this going, for my sake anyway, and I know other folks felt the same way, was I just kept thinking about, I had so many friends there still on staff who did not really see the issues. But once you see them, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm wasting years here supporting something that I don't really agree with at the end of the day. In large part, there were some things, of course, we agree with, the gospel and all that, but there was so much unhealthy there that people were coming out really hurt. And a lot of people are in counseling to this day, I think, over some of the stuff that they dealt with there. So we saw that happening, and we didn't want that for them. So I was like, you know what, we need to find a way to communicate to all the staff, all our friends on staff, in a way that will get to them, so they have a chance to review this stuff. Because if I just went off and started talking one-on-one to people, by the time I got to the second or third person, I would have been blacklisted, and everyone else would be told to avoid me or just doubt whatever I said. And the rest of my friends wouldn't talk to me, most likely, is how it would go. So, and we also just felt it was a proper biblical sort of way to approach it. At the time, it was like a Matthew 18 idea that we thought you come and approach someone. And then we realized later that's between individuals. There's a different prescription for when there's sin among the leaders of a church, where it's more meant to be addressed publicly, since it's affecting the whole church. But in any case, we went through that process. And it wasn't until later that year in 2015 that we, about middle of the year, we put the website out. After that, a ton of staff were reading it. They had just moved into the campus, and there was all this buzz about it. I'd say about 50 staff or so left that year, mostly over these concerns, leaving their campus kind of empty. And then, later in that year was when all this stuff came down with the ECFA. And then all these board members were either dismissed or left. And then this whole snowball started of that. So, but they're, still going out there, and somehow still gathering donations. So, a lot of it is just, we want to get our experiences out there for folks who have gone through similar stuff in other churches. Because one of the things that happened to us was, while we were going through all this and you started blogging about it, we got emails from people all over. We still get emails from people that come across your blog or our site who say, thank you so much for putting this out there. We went through something so similar, and it's so helpful to understand how you addressed it or something like that. So that's been really cool to see. It was surprising to see how common it is to have, a church or a ministry group that has a guy who's very controlling, and just not a healthy place for people to be.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Gail Irwin. Eventually, he really leaked those documents to me, and the report of his investigation was altered by, I don't know if it was directly by KP, but it was altered by somebody before you got the response. And he was concerned, did find some concerns, but those were stifled. And it was only later that he left, and then, he became somebody who blew the whistle. Now, eventually, I did get involved and started to ask GFA some questions, and they answered the first, 2 or 3, and then, wow, it was just like the door slammed shut on any kind of inquiries that I had. And I started looking into the taking cash to India, the the smurfing of cash. They first said, "Oh, we don't do that." Then they said, "Well, it's nothing wrong with it." And then they said, "Well, we quit doing it." This kind of a progression of responses from "we don't do it" to "it's nothing wrong with it" to "we're going to stop doing it," because of course they found out there was something wrong with it. And they told staff everything was legal, and somebody leaked that audio, and they came after me with lawyers, basically saying, don't take that down, take all that staff audio down. And so they were on the defensive, is I guess the point of kind of rehearsing this is stuff that you. They were on the defensive and led to the investigation by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. Did you feel vindication when the ECFA removed them from membership? I mean, did that feel like that was something that, since they wouldn't, work with you and listen at first, did that feel like, okay, that was something that should have happened?
I mean, it did help to have an outside, professional auditor, because we're not, we're laymen. So when it comes to that stuff, so we could see the FC reports that are public, and we could see the numbers not lining up, but we don't necessarily have proof as to why on our, from ourselves. Like, for example, just Canada money not being there on these reports at all for all these years when they sent, $100 million or so dollars. So, I mean, that's still being investigated up in Canada, I guess. But that kind of stuff you would see, it was so clear on the reports, or just these greatly rounded numbers, or like you had pointed out, just paltry amounts going to widows and orphans, whereas large amounts were going to the reserves or to buildings and things that it just seemed like it didn't line up with the majority of our appeals for donation and the marketing. And I was involved in the web marketing, so I got to see a lot of what came in. And my wife worked in the ministry partners department the whole time there too, for the most part. And she saw a lot of what came in large part, it was for widows and orphans or for Bridge of Hope children and missionaries. It wasn't largely for these buildings and large estates or whatever they would buy for land and stuff. So it didn't line up. But when we saw the cash reserve of more than $250 million, that was like just mind blowing. I mean, when we first did this letter, we weren't even aware of that stuff. And then people started looking into it and seeing it. And I'm like, wow, there's some big discrepancies here. But I mean, how do you appeal for urgent money that you don't have? But if somebody sends you $10, you'll send $10 to a widow. And then you've got $250 million in reserve sitting there. Like, it just didn't line up with anybody. Like, there wasn't any ministry in the world that did that on that scale, and of course they've got good cover stories for everything, very convincing sounding stories. Like, well, we were afraid the government was going to shut us down, so we hoarded years of reserves to be able to run our ministry indefinitely. But then you dig further and find, well, yeah, but still, the number of widows and orphans you say you support doesn't line up with this paltry amount of money that you say went to them in your FC. So there was a lot of concerns, but seeing the ECFA actually outline it directly, and the ECFA even reporting how they were lied to by KP or the leaders at GFA, saying they only had $7 million in reserves when they had $250 million, and then GFA claiming they didn't know. I mean, it was stuff like that where we were like, wow, that this is way beyond anything we imagined. So it was vindicating to see them pull, because we knew that would have an influence on donor trust. Even though ECFA, in some respects is a rubber stamp, it still definitely is widely looked to in the U.S. So yeah, that was helpful.
And you make an interesting point. They're looked at in some quarters as a rubber stamp. And so how much more of a shock really was it that they took the action that they did? I mean, things must have been bad, in other words, for the ECFA to take the action that they did.
Yeah, it didn't seem typical for them to do that at all with other problematic ministries that they had been eventually quietly removed or something. Like the donors weren't getting emails or anything, So yeah, it was interesting. And then Gail Irwin, with that, he sent us their fall report when he resigned. along with some other documents that you had commented on and published some of.
And you mentioned the excuse or the reason that they gave as far as we were saving up all this money because we were afraid the Indian government would shut us down. And I suppose there's a certain I don't know, validity to that, but that's exactly the reason why the Indian government would shut a charity down if they're hoarding cash. If they find out that they're doing that, if they're just enriching themselves or funneling money in ways that the donors don't intend, then that would tend to make a, a government suspicious, wouldn't it, of what
Yeah.
a charity is doing? So if you really want to call attention to yourself, bring in billions of dollars and don't use it right. I mean,
Right. Or bring it in tax free, kind of that
yeah,
also draws scrutiny because they're wanting to to look and make sure you're not running for profit entities with these dollars and not paying proper taxes. So that's one reason they have the FC set up. And so they're going to look. It does, unfortunately, and of course, what happened in recent years was they were shut down, as well as at least the entities they had in place at that time were shut down. Who knows what entities they set up since? But
they've set up several NGOs that don't really amount to anything, that don't do anything. They don't have websites. All they do is bring in the money from Will's Point. They collect it and send it over there, and then somehow it gets to Believer's Church. And I've raised that issue many times. I don't know if the Indian government minds or really what, if they haven't the resources to investigate. But uh, the the hospital benefited, that medical center
yeah,
benefited from money that was supposed to go to other things. And then eventually 20 some $1 million went back to Will's Point.
right. Well, and we even saw that email eventually during the court proceedings from David Carroll to KP, and David Carroll was a former auditor, and he claims in that email, as a former auditor, this looks really bad, and this looks like the money all went to the hospital that should have gone to these other things. So even from internal communications, we saw admittance of that. And I think one of the sad things is they kind of ruined it for other ministries, like Compassion had to shut down in India, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And they had what appears to be a very legitimate ministry because, a lot of folks are actually meeting the child they've supported for 18 years. So you can't really fake that.
Right.
I mean, that's much tougher. So it's sad from that perspective that this kind of shenanigans, where you're falsifying numbers or you're just, if I gave them as much grace as I could, they just didn't have their books in order to be able to prove anything of where the money was spent, right? And they sell out of court, but it just ruins it for so many ministries because they want that oversight.
Well, GFA was eventually and has been sued and is being sued in Canada. That's an ongoing situation there. I guess we've, in a way, talked a little bit about this, but is there a lesson for other nonprofits that you think should stand out from the GFA story? I mean, it's been quite a saga, really. Now going back to when you left in 2011. Well, I guess really going back further than that when you started. It's taken up now. You said 2005. I started blogging in 2005, so we've got two 15-year stories here. They intersected. But what's the takeaway for nonprofits?
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S. we have more religious freedom, which is good, but by nature that means you have less government oversight on religious organizations. So it can be easy for them to, be underhanded, I guess, when it comes to things like finances and assets in the U.S. It's not as much so in Canada, so there might be more teeth up there to their Canada operations. But I think from a nonprofit governance and management perspective, there's a lot that you should be taking care to do as, let's say, as a board member of a nonprofit, for example. I'm sure the board members who left GFA wish they had, asked for or done certain duties that are really duties of a board member. And it was positioned as, well, you're more of an honorary board member, so you don't have to worry about all that stuff, just sign on the dotted line. But that's really not actually what a board member's role is. And that actually could expose you to some big liability. So, for folks who are in governance of these organizations, just understanding what questions to ask, consulting groups like ECFA or, different resources on, what should the finances be looking like when I look at a statement, an audited statement? Are there red flags I can look for? Hopefully the ECFA is looking for those, anyway, that's one piece. The other piece is, I think there's a website actually that has 10 warning signs of an unhealthy group, or an unsafe group. And Steve Hassan, who's another guy who's appeared on your
Yes.
vodcast, I love his book on, he has a few books just about the manipulation techniques that groups will use that are unhealthy, and whatnot. So that was very helpful. But if you just look at the basic checklist of 10 signs of an unhealthy group, that would go a long way. And really just do an internal analysis. Go over there in person, interview people, ask them questions that would indicate yes or no on those questions. And you'll quickly start to see, man, there's some unhealthy things here going on. Like an unwillingness to answer questions, for example, those kinds of things. Or maybe, a very influential leader personality who's a single guy who's, kind of got a personality cult going on or something. There's those warning signs you can look at. So I think that will help in organizations as well as churches too. There's been, I know you covered the Mars Hill situation. That was a church where there was very abusive, toxic leadership that really damaged a lot of folks. And the fallout is a lot of folks don't want to come back to church because they're afraid that's going to happen again. They don't have a level of trust there. There's some good books written by like Mark Dever about healthy churches and church community that we've been going through to just talk about the biblical calling of a shepherd or a leader of a Christian church is that they lay down their life for other people in the sense of being willing to just love them and serve them and be the servant of all, as opposed to lording it over them. So that idea, when you see people doing the opposite and kind of saying, well, I'm the big guy, I say how it goes here, that's a warning sign in and of itself. But when people see the leadership being humble and being open to questions, open to criticism, being willing to, apologize when there was something wrong or be open about it, then they've got a trust there and they're willing to, put themselves into their church. So I think that can be a lesson for church leaders, for all of us really in general.
All right. Well, I think Steve will be happy to hear you mention his work. He'll probably give us a retweet now that that's the case. Well, those are very good words, and I think you've hit the two key points that I certainly would have thought of too, and that is the financial and the leadership. Those points of how does the leader lead and how transparent is the organization. Those are things that as I approached GFA, boy, the red flags just went up. So I want to thank you for sharing today. I really appreciate your insights and sharing some things that you went through. And also thank you for your help with the blog over the years. You kept me going there, and appreciate that very much. When times were some hard there with Pathos, but anything else you want to close with, or any other parting thoughts?
Yeah, I guess if anything, a lot of folks get very depressed about the fact that they spent so many years working for an organization or being part of a church that turned out to be unhealthy, right? Or oftentimes you've got Christian leaders that will fall, and kind of go off the rails. or have affairs or, whatnot. It happens all the time. And people get very disillusioned by that. And a lot of folks will leave the church for that. It's heartbreaking to see it. And I think I also had this idea of sort of idolizing certain Christian leaders in a way, or at least putting them in this place where I would give them de facto trust and not really be a Berean about what they say and go investigate the word and make sure it lines up to reality and scripture. And every leader is just a guy or a woman who has been elevated to a position of leadership. Biblically, that means they're the servant of all, but pride will get into anybody. And so I feel like if you look at the perspective of a healthy church, you should constantly have an engagement with the leaders and the elders in the congregation, or however you're set up, engagement with people and openness and accountability across every level of leadership. So it's more of a flat leadership structure in the church in that respect. And when you have that type of dialogue, you can get past any of these issues that come up and probably help the leader not go off the rails, because it's when people don't question them that they do questionable things, as the saying goes, because you're just tempted to do it and nobody's going to question you about it. And then you can just sort of go down that slippery slope. So I think that will be of help for folks who are just thinking, I could never do this again. No, there's a biblical prescription. It's just not often followed, where there's ways to engage with the elders. There's the type of engagement that should always be going on with leadership, to where we hold each other accountable as fellow believers. So when we practice the Bible, we can continue to be healthy, even though there will be problems, because we're all sinners. But the other thing is, as folks who worked for an organization, really serving the Lord is what our agenda was. We weren't there to serve the men who were leading that organization. The fruit of that will last. So in my mind, the biblical test for whether you were faithful, whether you're going to be rewarded and recognized by God, is, were you faithful to the opportunities I gave you? And people were given an opportunity to come in. Our impression was that this was a legitimate thing going on and it was healthy. And there were certainly legitimate things that came out of it, of course. It wasn't all 100% bad, especially our interactions with each other and some of the friendships we formed. But yeah, I think that can be helpful too, just to remember that, when your focus is on serving God and not other people, or advancing your own career or something, then you don't have to worry if the leader ends up going off the rails one day, because that's between him and God. What you did, faithfulness to your opportunity, is between you and God, and that's where you're judged. So I feel like that can be helpful in that respect too.
All right. Those are good words. JD, I want to thank you for spending some time chatting today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Warren.
All right.